to be in this building, to be in the same place that the Pontiff spoke, and to be in the company of so many very intelligent people with such diverse perspectives. I mean, if we think about the methods that have been brought to bear, they include social critical analysis, brain biology, statistics and epidemiology, like Angela presented, policy analyses, what I might call a pastoral approach of working with the populations themselves, Ivan, Aussie, Father Buonito, Father Boulay. My approach is quite different, so I want to begin with a minute's explanation of what it is. I am an engineer and a systems analyst. I build quantitative models to predict the consequences of changing laws and policies. Today, the policy change being legalization of cannabis. So I try to predict quantitatively what would happen to the number of users, the number of people who are dependent, the structure and conduct of the industry, prices, profits, corruption, violence in the final market countries, and all the way back up the supply chain into the global south. The way that I do this is with the same sort of analytical models that people in industry use. Kevin mentioned that Privateer Holdings is a bunch of Yale MBAs who are pouring tens of millions of dollars into this industry. They do not do that until they've done a quantitative analysis to project the return that they will earn on that investment based on a projection of how they think that the market and industry will evolve. I'm a professor. I teach those methods to master's students. I don't teach MBAs. I teach public policy and healthcare policy students, but I teach people how to use the methods that they use. And in my research hat, I apply those same methods, but better, to build those same kind of models, not to inform industry, but to inform policymakers and people such as yourselves. So that's the sort of background I bring. I do this for cocaine, for heroin, for organized crime, terrorism, and for the last 6 years I've been focusing on the cannabis industry and legalization, working with a great many wonderful colleagues at RAND, producing publications such as those above. I want to begin with a couple of definitions of what legalization is not and what it is. I am not going to talk about decriminalization or depenalization, repeal of mandatory minimums, even legalizing possession for personal use. None of those rise to what I'm going to talk about today. They may all be perfectly fine ways of reducing some of the adverse effects of prohibition, but legalization, for my purposes today, means making it fully legal for someone to supply, someone to produce and supply. And Kevin made a terrifically important point that this is not a binary choice between prohibition and legalization. There are many different ways of doing prohibition. There are many different ways of legalizing. Often, the discussion about how to legalize falls into technical things like, should the tax rate be 10% or 20%? Should the stores be banned from being within 250 meters of a school or 500 meters? Those are not the important choices. The important architectural choice is what kind of entity is allowed to supply. And on the bottom of the slide that's showing now, there are 4 strikingly different architectures. At the most limited level, you could say you can only grow for your own use. One step beyond that would be a co-op model, where small groups of people could pool their own growing privileges and share but not sell. Beyond that, you could allow small nonprofits or larger nonprofits. You could allow government. Those are all different architectures. Different yet again is what the United States states are doing, which they call the alcohol model, but whose central characteristic is what Kevin described, and that is allowing for-profit companies to be the ones who produce and sell. And the simple bottom line of my talk is, if you want to legalize, don't make the mistake of thinking that the only way to do that is to jump past all these intermediate options and go all the way over into that corporate model. That corporate model is what's going on in the United States, and Nora has already shown you this graph, and Kevin talked about it also. I just want to make 2 points before proceeding. The first is that the United States has not yet legalized. There are states that have legalized, but the federal law remains in place, and in a federal system, that matters. For instance, the companies have to go to private equity markets. They cannot form corporations yet and raise money on Wall Street. There are implications for taxes that drive them nuts, and if I talked to you about them, I would put you all to sleep, but they matter. There are also implications for preventing the tobacco companies and other large companies with large market capitalization from moving in yet. So we have not even truly started legalization, and it will take something like 25 years after the change of the national law to fully see the consequences. And the reason I make that point is just to explain why I think my modeling approach has value and why we can't just look at what has happened in Colorado so far to see what the long-run future is going to be of this industry. Okay, one more little bit of prefatory commentary is, does marijuana matter? And the answer is yes and no. It depends on the outcomes you care about. Yes, it is by far the most commonly used of the illegal drugs. In the United States, fully half of the people who use an illicit drug only use cannabis. Yes, it matters in terms of the number of arrests. This is a simple plot of marijuana arrests per capita in the United States over time. It went down during the Reagan administration. It went up very quickly under Clinton. It's fallen again under Obama, but it's always been a large number. There are a lot of cannabis arrests. This next chart says, though, that for almost every other outcome measure that we care about, the cannabis part of the story, the blue part of the bars, is very small. It does not drive many deaths. It has almost nothing to do with the spread of bloodborne diseases like hepatitis and HIV. Importantly, it's not implicated much in crime within the United States, and it is not much implicated in incarceration. About 1 in 5 people in prison in the United States are there for a drug law violation. About 1 in 12 of them are there for a cannabis law violation. So it's only about 1 in 60 people in the United States who are in prison are there for a cannabis law violation, and the vast majority of them in the United States are high-level traffickers and producers. There are other countries where users end up in prison, but that's not the case in the United States. So none of those dimensions are much implicated in this issue, and that means that the impact on use is going to really matter. I had planned to do a couple of slides on health consequences, but I think they've been well covered by other speakers, so I'm going to skip past those. Here in 2 slides is my simple bottom line of what I think legalization might look like. So first of all, how big is the market now? It's about 6,500 metric tons. That number probably means almost nothing to you because it's very hard to think about what a metric ton of drugs means. So I've just done simple arithmetic to translate that into something more intuitive, which is hours of intoxication. And that turns out to be about 40 billion hours today, per year in the United States. That matters because when you do a social benefit cost analysis of legalization, many of the outcomes, like the need to treat more mental health problems, have price tags that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of millions is a lot compared to what any one of us makes on our job, but hundreds of millions is very small compared to 40 billion. The outcome that really matters is use. And so if you think marijuana use is great, legalization is good. If you think it's bad, you won't like legalization. Here's one other metric of the size of the market. Users self-report about 4 billion days of use each year. They underreport a little bit, so it's probably more like 5 billion. And here comes one of those very fancy pieces of mathematics. If I divide 40 by 5, I get 8. That fancy math says that on average, an average day of marijuana use involves 8 hours of intoxication. That's the first indication of something I'll mention a couple of times. Most of the use is not somebody who uses only one joint on a day. In fact, 50% is consumed by people who spend 50% or more of their waking hours under the acute influence of the drug. Over and above all of the long-term changes in brain that Nora talked about, the short-term impact of intoxication itself is substantial because it's not confined only to weekends. So that's sort of the size of the market. What do we think might happen with legalization? Well, here's one very simple sketch. There are about 40,000 people in prison right now for cannabis law violations. Let's suppose they all get out of prison. And let's just guess for the moment, I'll come back to this, that consumption will double from 40 billion hours to 80 billion hours, and the amount of dependence is going to go up by 50%. So what would that mean in terms of benefits and costs? Well, first of all, from the taxpayer's perspective, you would save about $1.6 billion in money that's now spent on imprisonment. But you would have about 1.4 million people who are dependent. Is that a good trade-off? And sort of the way you can think about that is, would taxpayers be willing to spend $1,000 a year to prevent one person from being dependent? Maybe. That's what we do with treatment, and in fact, that would be a pretty good treatment program if it achieved that. So taxpayers maybe aren't going to save so much money. How about if we think about it from the perspective of freedom? Pope Francis this morning talked about the slavery dimension. Well, on the positive side, that 40,000 fewer people in prison means 350 million hours a year of new freedom, freedom from being behind bars. But we juxtapose that with 40,000 million, that is 40 billion, extra hours of intoxication. In other words, having the prohibition purchases about 100 hours of less use for every hour that someone spends in prison. Now, if the use was all happy use by controlled users, that might still seem like a great deal. 100 hours of happiness plus an hour of freedom. However, about 50% of those hours are by people who meet the clinical criteria for substance use disorder. And I'll elaborate on this in a minute, but the trade-off now looks like this. For every hour of freedom gained from imprisonment, from reductions in imprisonment, we pay with 50 hours less freedom from dependence, specifically 50 hours of active intoxication by someone who meets the clinical criteria for dependence. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch. There's a whole book full of those kinds of ideas that elaborate on it, but I want to next defend the idea that use might double, because some people are skeptical about that. I think use could easily double if we fully legalized at the national level and truly went with a corporate model. And one reason I think that is use has already doubled in the last 25 years of gradual liberalizations of policy. The metric by which use has doubled is the number of people who self-report using in the last year. But we often measure not use in the last year, but use in the last month. And the number of people who meet that definition of current use, that's actually tripled. If we fold in intensity of use and count the number of days of use, that has quadrupled already during the period of liberalization. And if what we're really interested in is people who use daily or near daily, that has gone up 8-fold already during the liberalization. That's astonishing. Here on this chart, I'm comparing the number of daily and near daily users of alcohol and cannabis over time in the United States as measured by the same survey. So whatever the limitations of the survey, they're going to apply equally to both of those lines. If you go back to 1992, which is the middle of that graph, the nadir of marijuana use, there was literally 10 times as many people who were using alcohol daily or near daily as there were people using cannabis daily or near daily. And even back then, cannabis was by far the most commonly used of the illegal drugs. So it was fair to say at that time that if you're thinking about daily or near daily use of an intoxicant, you're really only talking about alcohol. But as you look over time and get to the right side of that graph, there's been modest growth in the alcohol line, but enormous growth in the cannabis line, to the point where it's now within a factor of 2. The number of daily and near daily cannabis users is now within a factor of 2 of what it is for alcohol. What we've seen over that period is that marijuana use has gone from something people did occasionally or on weekends to something they often do daily. The patterns of use have morphed from being like alcohol, used primarily on weekends, to being more like the way that cigarettes are used, often being used daily or near daily. So that's maybe a long-winded way of saying, yes, I think that the use could double. What I want to talk about next is, what is that use like? So I'm going to have a quiz. I'm a professor after all, so I'm allowed to try to wake you up with a quiz. And here's the test. What proportion of the US cannabis market do you think is associated with adults who have no substance abuse or dependence problem and who use on fewer than 10 times a month? That last thing seems strange. I'm basically trying to think of weekend-only users, but my data set doesn't tell me which day of the week they use. So use fewer than 10 times a month is essentially like use only on weekends, because there are 8 weekend days per month. All right, so think about it for a minute. What proportion of this market that people are trying to profit from do you think comes from adults who don't have an abuse or dependence problem and who are controlled users using only on days they do not work? What did you say? 70 was the guess. And that's a common guess I hear. It turns out that it's about 1/3 of the people who use, but it is only 2% of the consumption. It's 2% of the profits. It's 2% of the sales. Whether it's an illegal market or a legal market, those people who are the face that the industry puts forward in justifying trying to remove the prohibition are round-off error. They are irrelevant for the profits. They are just political cover. The consumption is absolutely concentrated in the small number of heavy users. This is a slide that I often use to try to make that point, but it takes a few minutes, so I won't walk through the details. Let me just say, this is a slide that shows that the great Italian economist Wilfred Pareto was right, so right that he continued to be right 100 years later. 100 years ago, that Italian economist coined the Pareto rule by observing that 20% of Italians owned 80% of the land in Italy. There is a concentration in the small number of people who were the biggest landowners. That sort of 80-20 rule applies all over the place. It applies to alcohol consumption, for instance. And if I took you through it, it turns out to apply almost exactly to cannabis consumption in the United States. The 20% of people who use daily or near daily consume 80% of the cannabis. What I do want you to look at, though, are these next two slides, which do a market segmentation analysis like we teach those MBAs to do. It's a pie chart. It breaks down the market. The right-hand half in blue is consumption by people who self-report enough problems with their cannabis use to meet the clinical criteria for substance abuse or dependence, or who report having been in drug or alcohol treatment. So these are people that we really do not want to have using a dependence-inducing intoxicant. They are half of the consumption. Young people are actually a very small part of the consumption, medium small part of users, but they tend not to be heavy users. The left-hand gray part is adults who don't have that abuse or dependence problem, but if I split that up, most of that comes from adults who use very frequently. So that dark gray wedge that's about a third, those are adults who are using basically every day, but are telling us that use is not bothering them or interfering with their functioning. And that can be true, or they might be deluding themselves. But that's a picture of what that consumption is like that will go up. And now I want to turn to the supply side of the market and underscore for you that prohibition really does work to drive up the cost of production. This slide summarizes sort of years of analysis where we've acted like an MBA business person, building models of how the industry operates, sometimes by getting direct access to their financial sheets and their spreadsheets, moving from left to right, from prohibition to more liberal regimes. So that dark black bar is where we were at sort of the beginning of the state legalization effort. Then there are some bars in there that I've labeled as quasi-legalization. That means things are state legal and they don't have to worry about state law enforcement, but they still have to worry about the federal prohibition. There are two bars over there labeled legalization with onerous regulations. Those are medical systems in Canada and the Netherlands where it's truly fully legal, including with respect to federal law, but it's a medical system, so they've got to do all sorts of quality steps that you wouldn't have to do in a recreational market. And the bars in yellow on the right are projections of what cost structures would look like in the recreational market after national legalization. And the basic punchline is very, very low. To make this concrete, already the Canadian medical manufacturer Aphria produces 60 grams per square foot in greenhouse. And if I walk down the road to the greenhouse farm next to me, or more formally look at the models that our agricultural extension services provide to farmers who are thinking about going into hydroponic greenhouse production of tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, they work out to about $5 per square foot per year. So if you divide 500 cents by 60 grams, we can anticipate production costs of about 8 cents a gram. That's like 3 or 4 cents a joint. That's about 1 or 2 cents per hour of intoxication. Marijuana is just a plant. It's not hard to grow. Any professional farmer can provide it to the market at shockingly low prices. Now, many economists say that's nothing but, oh, I'm sorry, this is actual data from the state of Washington just showing the declines in price. And I guess a corollary of these price declines that I reinforce a point Kevin made, if prices are going to collapse on the basic commodity, then the for-profit companies are going to work very hard to brand their product, the same way that Evian water or Perrier water gets you to pay much more than it costs them to produce the water by associating their brand name with beautiful models. So what this industry is going to turn to in spades is what Kevin has shown you they already are. They're going to bundle it with other products. They're going to use it as a loss leader. For instance, a grocery store might give it away or sell at a very low price to get you to come in and then buy more of other products. Quite literally, the cost for a restaurant to comp you a joint, if they thought that would increase your appetite, will be about the same as the cost of a sugar packet to them. So many economists say this is nothing but good news because low prices are good for consumers. Well, they're good for consumers who are in control of their consumption, but they may not be good for consumers who have trouble controlling their consumption. And what I would have spent a few minutes on here is trying to point out that the size of the tax that would be necessary to prevent the collapse in production cost from translating into a collapse in prices to the consumer is far too large to collect because the black market would evade the taxes. So very briefly, California's tobacco tax is $2 per ounce, never mind what an ounce is. It's about what a pack of cigarettes weighs. Already that tax generates 14% of the market being provided by people evading the taxes. In order to offset even half of the price decline, we would need a tax that is 70 times greater per unit weight. We could not collect that tax. So under a for-profit model, there would be no way to prevent a collapse in prices, and it turns out that lower prices really do increase use, and most pronounced for people who are heavy users and for the youth. So I would discourage any jurisdiction from going this for-profit model. I'd like to close with just two big uncertainties. The great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, "Predicting is very hard, especially about the future." My variation of that is predicting is very hard, especially about legalization. The one way that legalization could turn out very differently than what I've described is if it changes consumption of tobacco or alcohol or other illegal drugs or prescription opioids. This has come up a little bit so far. We've done a very thorough literature review. Very briefly, the data on alcohol is split right down the middle. Nobody knows. We'll just have to wait and find out. The data on tobacco is worrying. Historically, changes in marijuana supply that led to greater marijuana use led to greater tobacco use. As was mentioned earlier, there's suggestive data that there might be good news on prescription opioids. So what I'm flagging here is that's a big unknown. And I'd be happy to talk about it longer another time. The other big unknown is one that Kevin brought up at the end of his talk, which is, will this stop with only cannabis? And the answer is very possibly not. In the United States, there would be interest in extending it to other so-called soft drugs like peyote and LSD. There will also, I suspect, be in the next 15 years a larger range of performance-enhancing drugs, including cognitive enhancers that improve studying. They could be a question. And as was brought up in recent discussions, the global south is interested in the violence associated with supply. And if you are shot by a drug dealer, you are just as dead, regardless of whether that dealer was trafficking cocaine or cannabis. So I do think that legalization of cannabis may be opening up a bit of a Pandora's box. I would suggest that however dangerous it is to allow for-profit companies to be marketing cannabis, it's far more dangerous to allow them to market crack or methamphetamines. So let me close because I've used up all of my time. Legalization is a trade-off. There are good and bad sides of it. No one should celebrate. At best, we should think in terms of grudging toleration. There are many different ways in which one can legalize. And I would suggest that the way that the United States appears to be going right now, and almost certainly would have gone under a President Hillary Clinton, but it's hard to predict with President Trump, that allowing for-profit corporations is absolutely the riskiest, if not the most foolish, possible way to think about legalization. Thanks for your time.